Hello, welcome to another episode of Creators. So, Creators is a YouTube channel that is with the sole objective of promoting the history of science, medicine, and technology. We will have our very first in person interview with Professor Toyin Falula. That is come February 1st. 10 a.m. CST time and then 4 p.m. GMT time. Kindly dial in and let's have a very interesting dialogue. Today's episode on creators is centered on a book written by Professor Jonathan Roberts, which is titled Sharing the Burden of Sickness. And this fascinating work, which was published in 2021, speaks to a very recent phenomena that transpired on social media. So barely 48 hours ago, there was a conversation around, so a colleague had asked, or a senior citizen, Ghanaian citizen had asked what the advice of other commentators would be for a patient who had diabetes, whether they would advise a person to do traditional medicine or stick to orthodox medicine. There were obviously a plethora of ideas as to what the patient should do. This actually triggered this particular episode for the book reading, Creators book reading today. I'll be reading from page 224. And just to give a synopsis of Prof. Jonathan Roberts' work, as a matter of fact, this is a very fascinating book that you definitely want to get a copy. So when it comes to the history of medicine or healing in Africa, in the past, we've had several anthropological and records, and also we have sociologists and many other Western scientists write all kinds of books about healing and medicine in Africa. And usually you find an unbalanced narrative which seeks to propagate the stereotype that Africa lacks agency when it comes to the remit of medicine and healing. So you see the false hegemony of orthodox medicines, meaning that Africans did not have any form of indigenous medicines, and even if they did, they did not have any form of potency or efficacy for the management of various ailments. Of course, we know this is not the case. If you read Professor Roberts' work, you realize that he gives a very nuanced and then balanced narrative which chronicles various healing traditions in Accra, somewhere from, looking at a period between the 1600s to a very recent time. So you realize that he takes cognizance of the fact that beyond what we are used to, there are about 5 healing traditions. Of course, there could be more depending on how you stratify these healing traditions. So aside people who visit itinerary medicine vendors, that is one of them, and people who seek the counsel of a herbalist. Some would also go to their pastors, and then you have the Kolebu people going to actual, let's say, Western hospitals per se. So like you have the maybe Kolebu Teaching Hospital, which is a premier hospital, one of the premier hospitals in Ghana. And then so these are synopses of healing traditions that patients could or people could access if they find themselves requiring any medical treatment. And you realize that there's at present no formalized algorithm to tell what instigates people to choose or prioritize one of these healing traditions over another. or what influences the interrelatedness, or why someone will want to couple 2 or 3 of these healing traditions in no particular order. I remember the work of Professor Amadi Graft Johnson, and she spoke very eruditely about healer shopping, where, for instance, people could be on orthodox medicines, but they could also be seeking healing also from their pastors. They could be moving from one herbalist to another. So Professor Robert's work actually gives us a panoramic view into the healing traditions of Africa, or in Accra. So this is definitely a book you want to grab a copy. So today I'll be reading from page 224, and I know a lot of people are very familiar with the Kole. So Kole is so the Kole is more or less like a water body area which is closer to the Kolebu Teaching Hospital. Obviously, the Kolebu Teaching Hospital was named, gained its name from the Kole. So we'll be looking at what really is the story, that what is the cradle of the Kole, as whether as a water body, or what are the folkloric accounts of that area. So I read page 224. Interlude. Na Kole Onamereko. Interwar attempts to engineer Kole. For centuries, the people of Accra had set their calendars to the swelling and receding Kole Lagoon. Na Kole is one of the founding deities of Accra. It is said that the female water spirit was discovered when a group of hunters found 2 large pots containing beads at the bottom of the lagoon. When the hunters took the beads home to their encampment, a woman named Dede saw them and became filled with the spirit of the lagoon goddess. Afterwards, Kole became the guardian of the waters of the lagoon, and the Ghana state placed the entire watershed under the stewardship of the priest of the Kole Wulomo. In the family of deities in Accra, Kole became the daughter of Nai, the goddess of the sea, and the wife of Sakumo, the god of war. According to oral tradition, she is a moral force in the city, a spirit that distances herself from petty rivalry, as suggested by her slogan, Na Kole Onamereko, that is, to wit, elder woman Kole, you will see me passing by, as a spiritual force that is present yet aloof and beyond reproach. The Kole Lagoon as a geographical site is also significant as the palimpsest of memories for the people of Accra, a place where stories about the goddess are stored and retold. Oral traditions at the shrine of Kole are not as robust as they once were, but the priest still uses the water of the lagoon to bless, purify, and cure supplicants, and the stories of the goddess survive in the minds of the elders. The biography of Kole is best revealed peripatetically by visiting the small nodes of rock piles and concrete mounds known as Otutui that are tucked in and around the neighborhoods surrounding the lagoon and dotting the seashore. These are the children of Kole, touchstones of memory that release historical information within the minds of the goddess's followers. For example, a rocky outcrop near the lagoon shore reminds the priests of the Kole of how the goddess allowed the destruction of the city by the armies of the Akwemu in revenge against the Portuguese merchants who built salt pits on her shores. Another site triggers memories of a time when Na Kole defended Accra by taking the form of a woman who fed the armies of the Ashanti with unclean food, sickening the soldiers enough to allow the Ga to vanquish them. Like many of the lagoons along the coast of West Africa, Kole recedes during the dry season, forming mud flats and stagnant pools of water. During the months of June and July, It swells with rainfall and floods the low-lying areas of Accra. In centuries past, the lagoon burst its sandy banks every rainy season, rushing into the sea. The breaking of the bar signaled adequate rainfall for the staple crop of corn and prompted the Kole priests to perform a ceremony to inaugurate the planting season. The lagoon was also a source of seafood, and the residents of Accra cast nets from the shore to catch mudfish or waded along its banks to collect crabs. The priest of Kole allowed fishing in the lagoon with the exception of 2 weeks in late July and August during the Homowo Harvest Festival, when a ban on fishing was instituted as a way of asking the goddess to continue to refresh the supply of water and fish for another year. To lift the ban on fishing, the priest walked to the shore with an entourage from the shrine and symbolically threw a net into the lagoon 3 times, collecting the fish and sharing them with the royal and priestly houses of the city. The lagoon is no longer a major source of food for the people of the city today, but it remains an annual site of pilgrimage for the followers of Kole, a source of spiritual nourishment for those who worship the pantheon of Gan deities. Moreover, Kole is a marker of Gan linguistic identity. By telling someone Ekole Yashon, which literally means that his or her Kole goes to the sea. I mean, this is, you remember there's a book written by Professor Mary Esther Kropp, which is Kole Meets the Sea, a social-linguistic history of Accra. I think this was published somewhere in 1997. A very fascinating work there by Professor Dakubo. Now, by telling someone a Kole Yashon, which literally means that his or her Kole goes to sea, a Gan speaker can validate the ethnic identity of another Gan speaker. And when phrased in the negative, the words can be used as a warning that someone is a linguistic outsider. In a city that changed dramatically over the course of the 20th century, Na Kole was a constant that regulated Gan minology and culture. The spiritual significance of the lagoon was threatened during the cocoa boom of the 1920s. As traffic at the port of the Accra grew exponentially, the Gold Coast government hoped to eliminate the costly use of surf boats by dredging the Kole and transforming it into a deep water harbor, with Jamestown on one side and Kolebu on the other. In 1919, the Public Works Department tendered the contract to a British engineer who made a modest down payment of £50 to the House of Kole for permission to survey the lagoon, with a promise of a much greater sum of £15,000 as payment for the lease of the waterway in perpetuity. However, the project quickly ran into difficulties when the chiefs of Accra contested rights to the land surrounding the lagoon. When the city had expanded across the lagoon during the anti-plague campaign, it reached into the territory claimed by the chiefs of Ashatown, and since 1908, they had conducted vigorous political and legal campaigns to assert their titles to the area. In the colonial courts of the Gold Coast, sub-chiefs from various quarters of Ashatown argued about who settled the land around the lagoon first, and contested rights of the Kole priests to collect the harbor fees. The case was tied up for so many years that the contractor decided to abandon the project. The failure to convert the Kole into a harbor was a blow to the British aspirations to sanitize the city. Principal Medical Officer Selwyn Clark believed the stagnant waters of the Kole were bringing forth a plague of mosquitoes, and he continued to press the government to re-engineer the waterway. In the 1920s, the Public Works Department filled some marshy areas with refuse, but they awaited funding from the colonial office to completely dredge the lagoon. In 1929, after 2 years of lobbying, Governor Slater received official consent from the colonial office in London for a 6-year scheme to create a sea outfall which would flush the waters of Korle into the Atlantic Ocean. London deposited a hefty sum of £195,000 into the Gold Coast Treasury, and colonial engineers immediately set the work building tidal sluice gates to regulate the flow of water. They also made plans to dredge the lagoon and construct walls all the way up to the watershed, but financial retrenchment during the 1930s forced the colonial government to abandon the scheme. British engineers did survey a causeway over the sandbar, but the sea outfall soon began to fill with sand due to seasonal flooding. The government admitted 10 years later that the whole scheme might have never been undertaken at all. The 1930s was largely a period of stagnation in the Gold Coast Sanitary Division, and no new projects were undertaken. Again, the forces of biopower emerged, but again their power had waned. The House of Korle maintained its hold on the spiritual significance of the lagoon and continued to play a significant part of the healing traditions of the people of Accra. But with war looming on the horizon, the sanitation syndrome began to rear its head again, this time backed by a new type of colonial force, military medicine. This ends the reading on Korle. Do get a copy of Professor Jonathan Roberts' work, which is Sharing the Burden of Illness, looking at the history of healing and then medicine in Accra. Thank you, and join us in the next episode of Creators Book Reading, which focuses on the history of science, medicine, and technology for Africa. Thank you.